eventually, every state in the Union was represented in the division because they were constantly shipping in replacements to different units. The other reason that I wanted to call it Alamo Doughboy was because one of the cousins in the book was in the legendary Lost Battalion. Has anybody here ever heard of the Lost Battalion of World War I? You got a couple people? Good. The Lost Battalion was neither lost nor a battalion. They were a group of men from the 77th Division who, during the final huge battle of World War I, the Battle of New-Sorgon, had advanced beyond their flanking troops. And so, as a result, were completely cut off from the other American and French troops and were surrounded by Germans and were under siege for 5 days in October of 1918. And their situation was compared by historians as being similar to the Battle of the Alamo. The Battle of the Alamo represents an attitude of never giving up, no matter what the odds and no matter how bad things look, you just don't give up. Doughboy, of course, you've probably heard that moniker. That was a nickname for the soldiers, which caught on especially when they got over in France. And there's a lot of different theories as to where Doughboy came from. Probably the most widely accepted is the fact if you look at, I don't know if we don't have any Doughboys in here with buttons, but they're spherical buttons. They're not just round, but they're three-dimensional round, so they kind of resemble dough dumplings. I don't know about that one. I still say it's because they ate a lot of donuts, which you can see we have a donut stand out there. Donuts were kind of a new pastry in World War I, and the Salvation Army women were serving them donuts beyond the front. Now, of the 5 men in the book, 3 were in the infantry, 1 was in the Air Service. And the Air Service went on to become the Air Force. And 1 of them was in the Engineers. There were 4.8 million people who served in World War I from the Americans. 4.8 million. Now compare that to about 2 million men that served in the Civil War. That shows you the scope of, in 19 months of participation, 4.8 million people served. It touched nearly every family, and I find it kind of a crying shame when I do these talks and speak with people that so many people will say something like, well, I think my grandfather was in World War I too, but I'm not sure. They don't know what unit, they don't have any artifacts, and you can tell that the wheels have just started to turn. Boy, I wonder what happened to my own family during that war. About 2 million men served over in France. So less than half of them actually served over in France. And my grandfather actually saw a lot of frontline action, and was right in the thick of things for the last 2 battles of the war. The conditions over there, when you were in the infantry, were extremely tough. He was a runner in the war, and I'd like to actually read a little bit from the book. A runner was someone who delivered messages. Remember, all they had to communicate were pigeons, runners, observation balloons, and they had telephone wires that they laid down on the ground, but they frequently didn't work. So I want to read you a little bit from the book that talks about what a runner went through. And the gentleman, my grandfather's name was Judge Knott. So when you hear me talk about Judge, you know that's my grandfather. And he's talking to his son-in-law, Dennis. And I also mentioned Millie in here, who, again, was my aunt, his daughter. So I'm going to tell you about when he was a runner in his encounter with a German plane. The harrowing biplane incident was described in more detail by Judge to his new son-in-law in 1963. Dennis, Zita, who had just married Judge's daughter Elaine, was in the Army and busy complaining to his father-in-law about Army life. Dennis said he and Judge were sitting on a bench in Judge's yard in Raymond, Minnesota, overlooking the skating rink, when I started grousing about spending time at Camp McCoy. Was anybody shooting at you today? Judge responded. No, Dennis replied. Well then, sounds like you had a pretty good day. Judge then went on to tell Dennis that he was shot at by a German in a plane 50 years ago during the war. Planes, Dennis asked, doubtfully, the airplanes used in the First World War. At that point, Dennis said Judge looked him straight in the eye with the most incredulous expression on his face. Then Judge began recounting his days as a runner. His good memory was to blame. He relayed the messages almost verbatim, and he became a runner. The life expectancy of a runner was about 7 to 10 days. On one dispatch, in an area full of artillery shell holes, a German plane spotted the solitary Judge and began shooting to kill. Judge looked over his shoulder at the plane, tripped, and fell into a large shell hole, which is about 15 feet wide by 7 feet deep. The Germans had mounted machine guns on their planes, but the guns could not rotate or adjust their trajectory. That meant the planes had to point their nose at a precise angle and fly straight at their target. Lucky for Judge, the side of the deep shell hole provided cover, but the plane made a U-turn and came back shooting. Meanwhile, Judge had quickly crawled to the far side of the crater and clung to the opposite side, knowing he would be protected from the bullets coming from that angle and direction. Then the German pilot gave up. Judge said the pilot was wearing a scarf. On another message run, Mildred said Judge encountered a lone German soldier. In an act of mercy, Judge did not kill him, despite orders to do so. Once Judge was sitting through the woods, running through the woods, and saw a young man sitting on a stump, a German soldier. The German held up his arms and cried mercy and mother. Daddy said he couldn't kill him, as all he thought about was going home to his mother. He talked about that soldier all through his life and hoped that he made it home. So if there's one thing I want you to remember about my talk today, it's this, is that World War I forever changed the United States' role in the world. It set the basis of us becoming now the sole world superpower. It changed absolutely everything for us. At the time when the war was going on and before we had joined the war in 1917, there were only 140,000 men in the U.S. Army. We had a decent Navy. So you can see the huge task of building that army up to 4.8 million was incredible by itself. The German Kaiser thought we were a bunch of cowboys, and we weren't much of a threat. But I think the United States' role in the war changed everything, and I think the outcome would have been completely different if we hadn't entered the war.